Welcome to Trending Unpacked, the show where we explore the stories behind the trends shaping our world.
Yeah, we dig into, all the sources, the history, the complex research, the sometimes baffling social media stuff, and try to pull out what you really need to understand.
And today, wow, we are looking at something really big, a concept that's been part of religious discussion and definitely pop culture for, over 100 years? The rapture.
It really has, and it's popped up again, hasn't it, with this, surprising viral energy. Just this past year, 2025, this pretty specific historical belief just exploded, went from something talked about in certain circles to being all over TikTok, YouTube.
Right. That's exactly it. That sudden surge. That's what we want to unpack. Why is this idea, this, sudden taking up of believers from Earth, why is it trending now? Our aim is to sort of connect the dots from its maybe lesser-known theological roots to how it's showing up right now in 2025. Very visual, very anxious.
Exactly, because it's not just about understanding the belief itself, it's about what this intense focus tells us about, us, about our anxieties right now as a society. These kinds of big narratives, they don't just, predict the future. They really do reflect the present.
So let's trace that journey from 19th century writings to 21st century TikToks. It's quite a story. Oh, but first, a quick heads up. After we wrap up our look at prophecy today, we're switching gears quite a bit next time.
A hard left turn, you might say.
Definitely. We'll go from the end of the world to the medicine cabinet. We're going to explore why Tylenol is making headlines. So something different to look forward to.
Intriguing.
But for now, let's get into this rapture trend. Okay, so let's start at the beginning, really break it down. For anyone listening who maybe only knows the term from, a movie title or maybe a meme they saw scrolling, what is the rapture, theologically speaking? Where does the idea come from?
Right. So at its absolute core, the rapture is a belief system. You find it mostly within certain parts of Protestant Christianity, evangelical, fundamentalist traditions mainly. And the basic idea is that Christian believers, both those who are alive and those who have died but are resurrected, will be kind of instantaneously lifted up physically.
And where?
To meet Christ in the air, as the phrasing often goes. It's seen as this distinct event. It separates the faithful from everyone else left on earth. And crucially, it's often believed to happen before a really catastrophic period for the world, which is known as the tribulation.
Okay, in the air. And there's a scriptural basis cited for this, right? It's not just pulled out of thin air, so to speak.
You're right. The main passage, the one proponents always point to, is in the New Testament. It's 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verses 16 and 17. That text talks about the Lord descending from heaven. There's a shout, the voice of an archangel, a trumpet call. Then the dead in Christ rise first. And then, it says, those believers who are still alive will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air.
Caught up. That's the key phrase.
That's the one. The original Greek word there is harpazo, and it means something like to seize or to snatch away, sometimes forcefully. So rapture comes from the idea of being snatched away.
Got it. But here's something I think is really crucial, and maybe surprising to some, that scripture, 1 Thessalonians, it's ancient. But the way it's interpreted now, the whole dramatic sequence, the timing, that's actually quite modern, isn't it? This specific idea wasn't standard Christian belief for the first 18 centuries.
That's a hugely important point. Absolutely vital. The idea of a specific, sudden, maybe even secret removal of the church before a final tribulation period or before the visible second coming of Christ. That's relatively new. It really took shape and got popularized in the 19th century, specifically within certain evangelical movements, starting in Britain and then really taking off in North America.
Okay, 19th century. And if we're talking about how this specific interpretation got structured and sort of standardized, we have to talk about one person in particular, right? John Nelson Darby. Why is he so central to this?
Darby, yes. He's pivotal. He was an Anglo-Irish preacher, very influential back in the 1830s and onwards. And he was a key figure in developing and popularizing a whole system of biblical interpretation called dispensationalism.
Dispensationalism sounds complex. What's the key takeaway for understanding the rapture?
We don't need to get totally lost in the theological weeds, promise. But the practical outcome is what matters here. Darby divided biblical history into different stages or dispensations. He argued God dealt differently with humanity, particularly Israel and the church, in these different ages.
And the crucial innovation for the rapture was where he placed it in this timeline he developed.
Exactly. He positioned the rapture, this harpazo, this catching away, as a distinct event that happens before that final awful period of global suffering, the Great Tribulation. That's the novel part.
Yeah.
The pre-tribulation rapture.
Pre-tribulation, so before the really bad stuff happens.
Right. Before Darby, many Christians who thought about these end times passages believed believers might live through the tribulation, maybe be protected by God during it, but they'd still be here. Darby's system offered something totally different, a sudden escape before it even starts.
Ah, okay. So if you believe in that system, the structure itself almost demands a constant sense of, well, waiting, expectancy. It's not about bracing for suffering. It's about listening for that trumpet call to get out before the suffering.
Precisely. That pre-tribulation timing, that distinction, that's the secret sauce, really. It creates this powerful narrative of imminent, sudden rescue, which maybe ironically makes the idea incredibly potent and, marketable throughout history. It gives it extremely high personal stakes for the believer. Am I ready? Will I be taken?
That makes sense. Okay, so Darby lays this theological groundwork in the 19th century. How does this idea then jump from, theological circles and pamphlets into becoming this huge cultural phenomenon we recognize today?
Well, it percolated through various evangelical networks, Bible schools, preachers.
Yeah.
But the real mainstream jump happens later, in the 20th century, especially the latter half. Mass media played a huge role. There were books, films, TV specials.
And one book series in particular stands out, right?
Oh, absolutely. You can't talk about the Rapture in popular culture without talking about the Left Behind series. Started in the mid-90s. Those books were, well, they were a phenomenon. Sold tens of millions of copies.
They weren't just books. They basically wrote the script for how people imagine the rapture, didn't they?
Totally. They codified the visual language. If you ask someone on the street today, what does the rapture look like? Chances are they won't quote 1 Thessalonians or Darby. They'll describe a scene that feels straight out of Left Behind or one of the movies based on it.
Like the empty cars crashing on the highway.
Exactly. The pilotless planes, the piles of clothes left on beds or in workplaces, the sudden vanishing of children. That specific dramatic iconography. That was largely cemented by popular fiction, not by deep theological treatises. It made the mechanics of the event seem instantly understandable, visually dramatic, and, crucially, emotionally real for millions of people. Believers and even non-believers absorbed that template.
It's kind of wild to think that a fiction series arguably had more impact on how the general public pictures the rapture than centuries of theology. It really shows how powerful storytelling is.
It really does. Fiction gives it the narrative shape, the characters, the emotional weight. And this whole system, this pre-tribulation idea, with its constant expectation of sudden escape, it naturally leads people to look for signs.
If it could happen any moment, you'd constantly be scanning the news, looking for clues that this is the time. We've seen that happen again and again, haven't we?
It's almost baked into the belief if you take the pre-tribulation view seriously. Every major crisis, a world war, the Cold War and threat of nuclear annihilation, economic collapses, pandemics, even things like specific astronomical events, they get immediately scrutinized. Filtered through the lens of prophecy, people try to map current events onto biblical descriptions of the end times.
Which creates this sort of cycle in history, doesn't it? Belief gets really intense, specific predictions might even be made.
Right, and then, well, the predicted date passes. The event doesn't happen.
Which brings up the skeptical viewpoint. If you look back, there's a long history of failed predictions. Specific dates have been set, promoted, sometimes by very prominent figures, going way back to the 19th century and happening repeatedly ever since. Why doesn't that track record of, frankly, being wrong seem to dampen the enthusiasm? Why does the idea keep coming back so strongly?
That's a great question, and it speaks to the psychological resilience of this kind of narrative structure. For someone deeply invested in this belief system, a failed prediction doesn't necessarily disprove the concept of the rapture itself.
How does that work?
Well, the thinking often goes, the prediction was wrong because the timing was misinterpreted, or maybe that specific sign wasn't the final one after all, or maybe we just don't know God's exact timing. The underlying framework, Darby's idea of a distinct pre-tribulation event, remains intact.
So the core belief is insulated from the failure of any specific prediction.
In a way, yes. The sense of imminence might fluctuate, but it doesn't vanish. The crisis that fueled the prediction fades. Maybe the anxiety level drops for a bit, but then the next global upheaval comes along, and that provides the fuel for the new final signs. The history of failed predictions becomes, for the believer, maybe just evidence that we need to be even more watchful, not that the event itself isn't coming.
The narrative kind of recalibrates and just waits for the next wave of collective stress to power it up again.
Exactly. Which leads us perfectly into what happened in 2025, where their whole predictive engine got hooked up to, well, the internet's algorithms.
Okay, let's zoom in on 2025 then, because this wasn't just quiet theological discussion bubbling under the surface. It was loud, it was viral, it was trending. What exactly happened? What kicked off this most recent surge?
It wasn't like one single sermon or book. It was more like a cascade, a rapid-fire series of short video clips that just absolutely exploded, especially on platforms like TikTok, YouTube Shorts, Instagram Reels. And the content itself was, well, not subtle. It was designed to be arresting. Highly dramatic visuals, jarring cuts, urgent-sounding music, big text overlays, all hyper-focused on framing current events as direct proof of prophecy.
Right, taking things happening in the news and immediately linking them to Bible verses about the end times. Very direct correlations.
Incredibly direct. You'd see clips linking, say, a specific record-breaking heat wave somewhere to verses in Revelation about the sun-scorching people. Or complex geopolitical shifts in the Middle East instantly tied to ancient prophecies about nations aligning for a final conflict, like Gog and Magog from Ezekiel.
It takes these huge, really complicated global issues, climate change, international politics, economic uncertainty, and boils them down into these bite-sized, easily shareable, and frankly often fear-inducing little packages.
Precisely. The efficiency is kind of breathtaking. What might have once required reading dense texts or listening to long sermons could now be absorbed, or at least encountered, in a few seconds of scrolling. The barrier to entry for encountering the message just plummeted.
And it wasn't just random users making these clips, was it? Our sources suggest a more organized effort behind some of it. Religious leaders getting involved directly in this new format.
That's a really significant shift, yeah. We saw pastors, evangelists, various ministries consciously adapting their methods. They started using high production values for live stream sermons, but then also creating slick, short clips specifically cut and edited for these fast-paced platforms.
Going where the audience is, essentially.
Exactly. Bypassing traditional church structures or media outlets to reach people, especially younger demographics, directly on their phones. Injecting that message of rapture imminence right into their daily social media feed.
So the message travels at the speed of the algorithm, hitting people who might never set foot in a church but spend hours on TikTok or YouTube.
Right. And once that content is out there, circulating wildly, the online communities themselves become these massive decentralized engines of interpretation.
How so?
Well, you'd see it in the comment sections, in forums, on dedicated groups. A major world event happens. Maybe a natural disaster, a big political development, a new technological breakthrough that feels unsettling, and immediately thousands of people jump online to discuss. Is this the sign? Which specific verse does this fulfill? What does this mean for the timeline?
It's like crowdsourcing prophecy interpretation in real time.
It really is.
Yeah.
A vast, distributed effort to make sense of what feels like accelerating global chaos by mapping it onto this pre-existing prophetic framework.
Can you give a couple of specific examples of the kinds of correlations that were really buzzing in 2025, according to the sources?
Yeah, two areas really stood out based on what we reviewed. First, as mentioned, climate events. It wasn't just general bad weather, but the sheer unprecedented nature of some things, the speed of flash floods, the intensity of heat domes in places they'd never occurred, the scale of wildfires. These were frequently framed not just as disasters, but as fulfilling specific apocalyptic prophecies about ecological breakdown or judgment involving fire and water.
Okay, so climate anxiety directly feeding into the prophetic interpretation.
Directly. And the second major area was geopolitics. Specific alliances forming or shifting, tensions rising between particular powerful nations, ongoing conflicts in historically significant regions. These were constantly analyzed through the lens of prophecies concerning end times battles, the rise of global powers, or figures like the Antichrist. The feeling propagated online was that events were moving too quickly, too strangely, to be mere historical coincidence. It had to mean something more.
It's fascinating how that works. But what's also interesting is how the rapture idea persists in culture, even outside of these intense belief communities. It pops up in movies, music, even memes, often used by people who aren't necessarily believers at all.
Oh yeah, pop culture keeps the concept alive and circulating. It's become a kind of cultural shorthand, thanks to decades of exposure, again, think Left Behind, but also countless other movies, TV shows, songs. The basic narrative is just so well known.
So even a quick visual gag, like an empty pair of shoes, can instantly signal rapture.
Exactly. The memification is crucial. You see these images or jokes online maybe about hoping the rapture happens before student loan payments are due or something like that. It often blends genuine existential dread with a layer of dark humor.
Which makes it incredibly shareable, right? That mix of fear and funny.
That combination is key to its online virality. The humor makes the terrifying concept approachable, even relatable. You can engage with the deep fear, what if it's real? What if I'm left behind? But diffuse it through irony or a joke. It makes the idea palatable, spreads it further, while simultaneously reinforcing the underlying anxiety, even if subconsciously.
So when you looked at the online debates happening around this 2025 trend, did you see clear sides forming?
Oh, absolutely. Very distinct camps emerged in the discourse. On one side, you had the believer view, For them, the sheer volume of signs, the intensity of current events, and the fact that so many people were suddenly talking about the rapture online, all of that served as powerful confirmation. It felt like undeniable proof that the end was truly immediately near. The trendiness itself became part of the evidence.
The noise validates the message in a way.
Right. But then you had the skeptical or critical view. These commenters would point to that long history. We discussed all the failed predictions from the past. They'd argue that the 2025 trend was less about genuine prophecy and more about, well, cultural noise. Maybe mass anxiety finding an outlet, amplified by algorithms designed to promote sensational content. They saw it as a recurring pattern, not a unique final countdown.
And the internet platforms themselves, they don't really care which side is right, do they? They just register engagement.
That's the algorithmic twist. The platforms are neutral on theology, but biased towards engagement. So a skeptic posting a detailed thread debunking a specific rapture claim that still uses the keywords, interacts with the topic, and inadvertently boosts the overall visibility of rapture discourse.
Wow. So both believers sharing excitedly and skeptics arguing against it actually contribute to making the topic trend harder.
Exactly. It becomes this weird self-perpetuating cycle. The more people talk about it, for whatever reason, the more the algorithms push it, making it seem even more urgent and important, which causes more people to talk about it. And round it goes. The conversation itself starts to feel like proof of its own significance.
Okay, let's try to pull back a bit and synthesize all this. We've gone from Darby's 19th century ideas through the massive cultural impact of things like Left Behind, right up to this very intense algorithm-fueled moment in 2025. Let's talk about the so what. Why does this particular idea, the rapture, have such enduring power? Why does it keep trending, even reaching people who aren't part of these specific religious traditions?
Well, I think apocalyptic narratives in general tap into something pretty deep in the human psyche, don't they? There's a fundamental need, maybe, for narrative closure, for answers, especially when things feel chaotic or out of control. The rapture narrative is particularly compelling because it offers a very specific, very dramatic ending.
Yeah.
It promises ultimate resolution, a clear separation that the good are saved, the world faces judgment. In a world that often feels incredibly messy, ambiguous, and complex, that kind of stark, defined ending can be paradoxically almost comforting for some.
It cuts through the noise. It takes these huge, overwhelming problems, climate change, political instability, you name it, that seem maybe unsolvable, and it offers a single, decisive, final answer, a divine intervention that just sorts everything out.
Exactly, and that's where we see its function as a kind of sociological mirror. The intensity of the rapture trend in 2025, arguably, wasn't really about accurate theological prediction. It was acting more like a cultural barometer, measuring the level of collective stress and anxiety in society.
So people aren't necessarily becoming more devout in a traditional sense, but they are becoming more anxious. And the rapture story provides a powerful, ready-made framework to channel and express that anxiety.
That seems to be a major part of it. And our sources specifically pointed to some key anxieties driving the 2025 surge. You should probably spend a moment on those.
Yeah, let's revisit those. What were the specific pressures pushing this trend?
Okay, so three main drivers really came through in the material we looked at. First, and maybe most visibly, climate change. The increasing frequency and intensity of extreme weather events, the fires, the floods, the heat waves, they weren't just news stories anymore. They were becoming part of lived reality for millions.
Right. Tangible evidence that the systems we rely on are becoming unstable.
Precisely. And these events map almost perfectly onto biblical descriptions of ecological catastrophe and judgment. It makes ancient prophecies feel suddenly frighteningly relevant and contemporary. It feels like the earth itself is groaning, just like the text described.
Okay, so climate anxiety is driver number one. What's the second?
Political instability. Widespread feelings of uncertainty about global leadership, deep political polarization within nations, the outbreak or threat of major conflicts involving powerful states. When political solutions seem elusive or systems feel fragile, people start looking elsewhere for answers or escape.
The idea of a sudden divine intervention, the rapture, can seem appealing when earthly powers seem incapable of ensuring peace or security. It offers a kind of ultimate decisive political reset.
Yeah, it bypasses the messy human political process entirely. And the third driver, which adds a particular resonance post-2020, is that lingering collective memory and fear related to pandemics.
Ah, interesting. How does that connect?
Well, the global experience of the COVID-19 pandemic gave everyone a very real, very recent taste of sudden society-altering disruption. It showed how quickly things can shut down, how easily people can be separated, how an invisible threat can change everything almost overnight. That shared trauma, that memory, makes the core narrative of the rapture a sudden disruptive event that instantly separates people and changes the world feel much more plausible, much more imaginable than it might have felt before. The idea of abrupt, nonlinear catastrophe isn't abstract anymore. We've all lived through a version of it.
That makes a lot of sense. The pandemic experience basically primed us to believe in sudden, massive disruption. So the trend isn't just about theology, it's about this convergence of climate anxiety, political instability, and post-pandemic shock, all finding expression through this powerful existing story.
I think that's a very accurate summary of the analysis. And then, of course, there's the role of the internet and pouring gasoline on that fire.
Right. Let's talk about that amplification effect again. How does the internet change the game for beliefs like this?
Fundamentally, historically, these kinds of ideas or revival movements would spread relatively slowly. Through preaching, books, pamphlets, word of mouth within communities, it took time. Now, social media platforms, viral videos, live streams, they accelerate that cycle dramatically. Information, or perhaps misinformation, spreads almost instantaneously. Beliefs and the anxieties tied to them can intensify incredibly quickly.
It's not just the speed, though, is it? It's also the reach. It breaks out of closed communities.
Exactly. That's critical. There are fewer gatekeepers. End times content can reach a much wider, much more diverse audience than ever before. People who weren't actively seeking it out might encounter it simply because the algorithm detects their underlying anxiety about, say, climate change or political news, and serves them rapture content that claims to explain it all.
So you don't need to be in the choir already to hear the sermon, so to speak. The algorithm brings the sermon to you based on your other anxieties.
Pretty much. And the consequence of that rapid, widespread dissemination is a palpable intensification of that feeling we talked about, that this time it's real. This is really it. When your feed is constantly serving you clips correlating every news event with prophecy, when you see thousands of comments debating the signs, it becomes psychologically harder to dismiss it all. Even if you're skeptical, the sheer volume and intensity create a pervasive atmosphere of urgency. The noise itself starts to feel like the message.
It's an incredibly powerful feedback loop. Global anxiety fuels the search for prophetic meaning. The internet algorithms amplify those interpretations, which creates more anxiety, which drives more searching.
The narrative feeds the platform, and the platform rewards and spreads the narrative. It's a highly effective mechanism for amplifying cultural stress.
And maybe, in a way, this whole phenomenon is less about predicting the end of the world and more about reflecting the state of the world.
That certainly seems to be the key takeaway from the analysis. The trend becomes a very vivid, if perhaps unsettling, indicator of how profoundly stressed and perhaps overwhelmed we feel as a global society facing multiple converging crises.
Which brings us perfectly to the final thought we want to leave our listeners with today, something to chew on.
Yeah, thinking about this direct, almost measurable correlation we've discussed between the cultural obsession with the rapture and these very real, very documented global crises. Climate disruption, political turmoil, lingering pandemic fears. What is this trend truly predicting? Is its primary function predicting a specific future theological event? Or is it actually functioning more like a societal fever chart, simply showing us, in stark terms, the degree of stress, anxiety, and maybe even the deep yearning for some kind of definitive resolution that exists within our world right now?
That's the question, isn't it? Whether you approach this as a believer, a skeptic, or just someone trying to understand the cultural currents, the fact that the rapture narrative surged so powerfully in 2025 tells us something significant about this moment in time we're all living through.
Wow. Well, that was quite the journey. We went from John Nelson Darby's theological innovations in the 19th century through the cultural dominance of things like Left Behind, right into the heart of the 2025 social media storm.
It really covers a lot of ground, doesn't it? History, theology, pop culture, technology, psychology. It's a fascinating case study in how old ideas get new life and new urgency through modern means. Thanks for unpacking it with me.
Absolutely. Thank you for walking us through it, and thank you for listening and engaging with this material. Just a reminder, next time on Trending Unpacked, we are making that sharp turn we mentioned, from prophecy to pharmaceuticals.
From the heavens to the head, Kyle.
Exactly. We'll be exploring why Tylenol, of all things, has been making headlines recently. We hope you'll join us for that exploration then.